we have Ann Pearce with us. She is the Invasive Species Outreach Specialist at UW-Madison. And she was saying beforehand, her life is all about removing invasives. So I invited her to join us so that she can maybe plant some native plants in her new yard after our plant sale in 2021. So Ann is going to talk with us about using citizen science to address invasive species. There's some tools, there's things that we can do as individuals.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for inviting me here tonight. As Lisa said, I am an invasive species outreach specialist out of UW-Madison, so I'm joining you from Madison tonight. And my primary role at UW is coordinating a program called the Wisconsin First Detector Network, which I'll talk more about later. And so as Lisa mentioned, tonight we're going to be talking about invasive species. It's kind of the counterpart to all of the great native plants that your group promotes so well. So it's going to be, I feel like the invasive species is a little bit on the gloom and doom side of things, but today we're going to talk about actions and projects that have actually positively made progress against invasive species. And so before we start, I'm actually going to ask John to launch our first poll, which is just to ask about if you have a particular invasive plant from this list that is a nemesis of yours. I heard somebody already mention that they were working on controlling buckthorn recently. But if you have any of these invasive plants that are your least favorite, you could vote for those. Or if your least favorite invasive plant is not on this list, you could type into the chat box too. Then if we share out the results, it looks like buckthorn is the winner for the least favorite, followed closely by garlic mustard. And then looks like Greg wrote in that the bush honeysuckles are a real problem as well. So not very surprising on that front. I'm going to close this out and then move on to talk about the definition of invasive species. I think a lot of different definitions get thrown around, and with my program, the First Detector Network, we use a definition that very closely aligns with the definition that Wisconsin DNR uses, which is that invasive species have the three characteristics listed. Number one, they're non-native species, and for the purposes of the DNR definition and ours, we just consider that to be it's non-native if it wasn't here in Wisconsin at the time of European settlement. The second characteristic is that that species is growing or spreading rapidly. And then the third is kind of the key thing that sets it apart and really makes it invasive, is that it causes or has the potential to cause harm. And that could be economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human or animal health, or a combination of those. And so I just like to start with this to get everybody on the same page in terms of invasives. Here in Wisconsin, if you're not familiar, we actually have a state administrative rule called the NR40 rule that is mainly there to provide education about invasive species. And the goal of the rule is to prevent introduction of new species to the state of Wisconsin or spread of existing invasive species. And so basically what this invasive species rule does is it will list a particular species as invasive, and it classifies it as either a prohibited species or a restricted species. And this rule covers all taxa of species, so plants and animals and plant diseases. Tonight, obviously, we'll focus on plants, because I know Wild Ones is focused on plants, and that's also my area of expertise compared to animals or other taxa. So a little bit more about these classifications, because this does inform the work that we all do on invasive species and kind of what you are allowed to do or not to do with these species. So if a plant is listed as a prohibited plant in the state of Wisconsin, it's either not in the state yet, or it's only in very small areas. So it's still feasible to eradicate that plant at a statewide level. And then you'll notice that there's a lot of things that you can't do legally with a prohibited plant. So you can't move it, you can't possess it or have it. You can't buy or sell it, or give it to a friend, or basically bring it into the state or introduce it to a new area unless you have a permit. Restricted species are those that are already pretty widely established, and so there's no way that we'll ever eradicate them at a statewide level, but they're still deemed worth managing or worth regulating. And then these species have very similar restrictions or regulations, but you'll notice that whereas you're not legally allowed to possess a prohibited species, you are legally allowed to possess a restricted species. And so what that means in real life, I guess, is that if you were found to have a prohibited species on your property, the DNR could force you to remove that species or force you to pay the cost of removing that. What it looks like in a typical instance of a prohibited species being found is that the DNR is basically going to do everything they can to make it as easy as possible for you to get rid of that species. So in some cases, they have money to actually hire a contractor to deal with it for you, or if you're able to deal with it, then that's great. It certainly does not look like, you know, DNR mailing you a ticket with a fine, because this rule is really meant to be educational. Now, there are other species that are considered invasive that aren't going to be in one of these two categories. So an example could be something like Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot, which is a non-native plant that is clearly spread in a lot of places. And for anybody doing prairie restorations, you know that it's ecologically damaging, especially in that setting. But basically at the time that this NR40 rule came on the books, in the state in, I think it was 2009 when it first went on the books, Queen Anne's lace was already so widespread across the state that regulating it wouldn't make any appreciable difference in basically the state's ability to manage it or limit its spread. And so just recognize that while the DNR has this list of many, many species that are considered invasive, there are others that are still definitely invasive, they just might not be regulated. So to share a couple of examples, the species on the left is what I consider kind of the poster plant of the prohibited invasive plants world. And I'm curious to know if anybody recognizes this plant. It has not yet been found in Wisconsin. And if you do recognize it, I invite you to type it in the chat box. And one clue is it's known as the plant that swallowed the South. I see one answer. So it looks like John knows the answer. So John guessed kudzu and Judy guessed wisteria. It is related to wisteria because they're all in this legume family, but John was correct that it's kudzu. And so you might wonder why the state regulates a plant that's not even here. Well, basically, because kudzu is on our prohibited species list, if and when it shows up in Wisconsin, there's going to be a legal mechanism to deal with that infestation as soon as it's found before it becomes the plant that swallowed Wisconsin. So basically, we can more effectively manage these new infestations if they're on our regulated list. And I will say that the closest population of kudzu that I'm aware of is in Evanston, Illinois. I think it's along one of the metro lines that runs to and from downtown Chicago, and they've been actively managing it, but it's still overwintered in Evanston, and so definite possibility that it'll show up and survive in southern Wisconsin. So on the right is probably a species that's much more familiar to more people. So if you know what this one is, feel free to type it in the chat box. This is our poster restricted species. It is relatively widespread across the state, especially for us in southern Wisconsin. Definitely not as widespread. And yep, we've got a couple guesses for garlic mustard, and indeed that's what it is. So I know over in your neck of the woods in southeastern Wisconsin and here in Madison, it's everywhere. We've got some lucky folks up north that don't have as much of it yet, and so they could still feasibly keep it eradicated from their area. But as you know from the populations down here in southern Wisconsin, we're never going to be able to fully rid the state of garlic mustard. So that has kind of fewer regulations attached to it just because of the feasibility of managing it. And so if you're interested in seeing the whole list of these regulated species, you can find that at the DNR's website.
I just ask something.
Sure.
Evidently in Ontario, they've released the weevils into the wild, but I haven't heard anything. I think they did it 1 or 2 years ago. I haven't heard any feedback.
Are you specifically asking about for the garlic mustard?
Yes, the weevils for the garlic mustard were
Yep.
actually released into the wild.
Yeah, and so I don't have a lot of information about the exact current status of that, but there are several invasive plants for which we have biocontrol agents. So in this case of garlic mustard, it's a weevil. In other cases, they're root-boring insects. Here in Wisconsin, we have a really successful purple loosestrife biocontrol program. And yes, I am aware that they have released this biocontrol agent for garlic mustard in Canada. It hasn't been approved for use in the United States yet, although I know that there are researchers working towards approval. But I also haven't heard kind of whether it's been successful in Canada yet either. So there's an invasive species conference, the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference at the beginning of November, and I expect that I'll learn much more then and get an update on kind of the status of this.
What I read was the University of Minnesota is monitoring what's going on up there.
Yep, and they've been heavily involved in that research. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't know any more at this point, but hopefully I will soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so moving on, kind of into the meat of our program is why do we, coming from the program Wisconsin First Detector Network, why do we think it's important to monitor and report invasive species? And so I'm just going to lay out a few reasons why basically our program exists and why we encourage people to get involved in invasive species monitoring. One thing that we really look for help with is just improving our knowledge of where these plants already are in the state of Wisconsin. And so on this slide, I'm going to show a series of maps for the invasive teasels. So that's common teasel and cutleaf teasel. And in 2010, the reports shown on the map are reports from citizen scientists and DNR data. And you can see that we didn't have a great idea of specifically where populations were. By 2015, you can see that especially in southeastern Wisconsin, we really know where the teasel is now. And we can see a few more pockets of it being mapped or recorded in southwestern Wisconsin in particular. And then by now, we've also recorded a few kind of standalone populations heading more towards northern Wisconsin. For instance, I know this population that I'm circling right here along the interstate is in Osseo, and every time I drive north to visit my family in Duluth, I see that population of teasel, and it is spreading. So knowing that we've got these pockets of a plant like teasel that are starting to form these satellite populations lets us know that we really need to pay attention to these species that maybe formerly we thought were only in the southern part of the state. And so understanding where these plants exist already and then where they're spreading helps us with a statewide strategy for managing these plants. At a single property level, it also helps inform management. So this map is really busy, but it's an example of some invasive plant mapping that we did for a woodland owner who has property in southwestern Wisconsin. And so basically, you know, you talk to property owners and they might say like, oh yeah, I've got a bunch of buckthorn and honeysuckle, it's kind of everywhere. And in some cases it is kind of everywhere. But you need to be able to actually put something on a map to make a management strategy. And so for this kind of southern portion of their property, these yellow dots represent individual buckthorn plants, and the blue ones represent individual autumn olive, and the red is barberry. And then we've got these big shapes with hashed lines that represent just kind of multiflora rose and honeysuckle just all over this parcel. And so from a land manager or landowner perspective, actually getting this on the map lets them see that barberry in this instance is maybe their least widespread woody invasive plant. And so to prevent barberry from taking over this entire parcel, they could probably pretty easily manage this small patch on the right side of the map and then the two individual plants. And then maybe they'll hit these individual buckthorns and then the individual autumn olives, and then they can start working on these bigger populations. So actually looking for these plants and then reporting them or putting them on a map really helps at a property level in terms of management. We also ask people to look for invasive plants because we know a little bit about how invasions of a new species or a species to a new location typically take place, and that's illustrated with this invasion curve. And so here on the left side of the graph, we have basically the area infested increasing from the bottom to the top of the graph. And then along the bottom of the graph, we just have time moving forward from left to right. And so once a species is introduced, it often seemingly spreads pretty slowly at first. The infestation might not grow very large in size, but at a certain point, that infestation really starts rapidly growing. So maybe the seed bank has built up, or there's more disturbance, and that species can really spread a lot. And it's usually not until that species is kind of on this upward swing in terms of the area that it's infesting that we actually even detect it or notice it as being invasive. And then more broadly, the general public doesn't tend to really recognize these problems until we've reached this point where the infestation is so big that, number one, it's difficult to manage, and number two, the cost to manage it has just gotten kind of too big and we can't really deal with it. And so I would say some of the things like garlic mustard and buckthorn and honeysuckle here in the southern part of the state, lots of people know about these plants, but for many sites, those infestations have potentially already reached such large sizes that we might have to give up on those for now in favor of dealing with other species that are at the earlier point in this invasion, I guess, process. But when it comes to monitoring, if we have more people that are actually looking for either new species or species that are around, but now you see them in a new location, that allows us to move this detection much, much earlier in this curve or in the process. So we can actually start managing these infestations when the size of the infestation is smaller, and then the costs to manage it will be much lower as well. And so really, this push for detecting populations early or getting more people to recognize invasive plants is the whole reason that the Wisconsin First Detector Network, or WFDN as we call it, exists. And so we're a statewide program, and we really focus on teaching people about invasive plants and other invasive species, and train people how to monitor and map and report invasive species. Number one, so we can hopefully detect new infestations much earlier, but also so we can support those other goals for monitoring that I mentioned, including just getting a better handle on where these species are across the state, and then helping landowners and land managers make management plans. And so I want to share a few examples of how the tools that we use with the First Detector Network and how some of our volunteers have impacted invasive plant management in Wisconsin already. And I'm going to start in your neck of the woods. So you might have remembered I showed this map earlier where we have a really well mapped populations of teasel in southeast Wisconsin. And this was an effort out of a group called CWISC, which is the Southeast Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium. So they cover the eight counties in southeastern Wisconsin, kind of going up the Lake Michigan shoreline. And back in, I believe it was around 2011 to 2013, they had volunteers working on mapping 4 different species on all of the roadsides across their 8 counties. So they looked at the teasels, they looked at knotweed, wild parsnip, and purple loosestrife, I believe was the 4th one. And so these volunteers, these citizen scientists, collected really excellent data. And I don't know that the data was used right away. I wasn't working with this program back in 2013, But more recently, that data has been shared with roadway managers. And then in the last few years, CWISC had an EPA grant that actually allowed them to basically provide funding to right-of-way or roadside managers to manage over 2,000 of these populations of invasive plants that the citizen science volunteers had mapped on the roadways. And so this is a really great example of that volunteer provided information feeding directly into action on the ground and allowing these infestations to be managed. And we have examples from other parts of the state as well, particularly for roadside invasive plant management. For instance, we had a master gardener group up in St. Croix County that mapped the wild parsnip across a township to help develop a more informed management plan. So this is a really easy sort of project to help out with, because most of our roadside managers don't have the time or staff or ability to do the mapping themselves. So if volunteers can do it, they can then use that information to get funding from through their budget process, or try to get outside funding to deal with these populations that spread so easily along roadsides. Another example that started in about 2018 was the Dane County Parks Program. So they've got something like 60 parks properties across Dane County. But in 1 year, we were able to get some funding to train Dane County Parks volunteers to use our reporting tools. And so in that first season, they recorded over 1,200 invasive plant infestations across 22 of their properties. And so this map zooms in on a few of those properties that have friends groups that have been actively managing the invasive plants. And so they actually took this from starting with mapping the infestations to feeding into an overall management planning for the parks, where the volunteers and the park staff are able to work together because they have the information mapped now. And then they use some additional programming to kind of track that management of these infestations that have been mapped. And so, like I said, that started in 2018, and there's a few thousand reports, or about 1,000 every year, I would say, additional reports from Dane County Parks volunteers that have really helped them kind of tighten up their communication around the invasive plant work that they do across all of their properties. And then a third example, and this is a great example of early detection, is that this July, Japanese stiltgrass, which is the plant shown in the picture at the right, which is on our state prohibited list, was found in Wisconsin for the very first time in La Crosse County. And although the person who found it is a professional botanist in Minnesota, she actually discovered this because she was doing citizen science volunteering for the Wisconsin Rare Plant Monitoring Program, but she used the reporting tool that we use with the First Detector Network to actually report this infestation. So that tool is called the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, and I'll talk about that later. But basically, as a citizen scientist, she submitted that report, and so that allowed us to immediately contact DNR with that report and get things rolling so that DNR could set up a crew of their state natural area employees to survey that property and remove stiltgrass and do follow-up monitoring and treatment as needed. And so that was a really cool example, although we're never excited to see a new invasive plant in the state. Because she knew about this citizen science reporting tool, she was really easily able to make that report. And then those of us who are working on the plants in Wisconsin were able to kind of activate the system to respond to the report. And then, I mean, we've already said this, that the distribution is really important. I just wanted to point out that we have this tool called the WISTIPP viewer, which is an interactive map. And so if you're interested in just kind of exploring where invasive plants have been reported across the state of Wisconsin, you can access this map and play around with it and make a custom map for yourself of particular species that you're interested in, or just see with this DNR classification menu under this colorful legend, you could see where prohibited species have been reported near you. And you can zoom in really far on this map. So certainly if you're working at a park ever, you could see what's been reported at that park or in your neighborhood or in your town. And if we have time later, I can kind of do a live demonstration of this map, but for now, I'll just let you know where you can find it. And you can get to it from our First Detector Network website. With the URL is listed at the top. And if you just click on the Tools tab, you'll see that WISTIPP viewer map. And there's a little quick guide on there too. So if you're not as familiar with using these kind of online maps, that will really quickly show you some of the features that you can use. And then I'm just checking out the chat box to check for questions. Somebody asked if I have a picture of teasel. I don't have one pulled up right now, but I certainly can pull one up later. And then somebody's been working on managing 17 acres, maybe of teasel, I don't know for sure, but they've had some success. So any success on invasive plant management is always good to hear. And then Lisa's asking if garlic mustard distinguishes itself over time. And Lisa, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. So if you want to turn on your mic and clarify, I'd be happy to answer that before we move on. Or if you want to retype the question. And I guess while we're pausing, before we move into some of the tools we use for reporting and monitoring invasive plants, I think this might be a good time, John, to pull up that other poll. So we've talked a little bit about, what invasive plants are and why we ask people to monitor invasive plants. But before we tell you kind of the nitty-gritty of how you can work with our program, if you're interested in volunteering, we're curious to know if people have participated in other citizen science programs. And so in this poll, we've listed several of the citizen science programs that are running across the state of Wisconsin or more broadly. So it looks like we definitely have some people involved in some of our pollinator monitoring. It looks like an eBird. I'm an eBirder. Although I don't have a smartphone, so I have to still write my lists by hand and then report them on the website later, but that works for me.
Note they might have to scroll a bit to find the submit button.
Sure. And while people are looking at that poll, Lisa clarified that her question is, does garlic mustard extinguish itself over time? And I'm going to mention that Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference again, because I'm helping to plan it, so that's at the front of my mind, and it's also coming up in a few weeks. And we regularly hear from colleagues in the Northeast United States who have had garlic mustard much longer than we have in Wisconsin, that they are seeing that at some point the garlic mustard populations kind of seem to die off. The one thing we don't hear though is, well, what does it look like? What happens? Like, we haven't heard definitive data on whether spring ephemerals are coming back when the garlic mustard populations seem to kind of crash. And if you're not super familiar with garlic mustard's impacts, it is an allelopathic plant. So it exudes chemicals that disrupts the relationship between the fungi in the root system. And it basically makes it more difficult for other plants to grow in that environment. And so, although I don't study allelopathy and I don't specifically study garlic mustard, I expect that there's probably lingering effects in the soil from garlic mustard being there for so long that even if the population kind of dies off, I'd be really curious to know what the long-term impacts are and whether the native plants return on their own or whether we need some restoration efforts on that. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. It seems like mostly people are involved in kind of the monarch watch and the bumblebee brigade, so some of our pollinator monitoring, which makes sense for a group of people that are interested in native plants. You can catch the pollinators at the same time. We've got some birders in the group, and then somebody mentioned that they're also in the purple loosestrife program, which is that biocontrol program I mentioned earlier, where you can raise the beetles that feed on purple loosestrife and release them and help control purple loosestrife that way. And maybe after tonight, some of you will become involved in Wisconsin First Detector Network, the program that I run. And next time you get asked a question about this, you can say that you're part of WFDN too. But there's a lot of really great natural resources monitoring programs in the state of Wisconsin. So it's really fun to see what people are involved in and check all of those programs out. So within First Detector Network, one more interactive online tool that I wanted to point out is our invasive species calendar. So this is kind of a phenology-based calendar, and phenology just refers to kind of the life stage or the timing of growth and development or natural events. You all might be pretty familiar with that. But there are over 140 plants alone that are listed on that NR40 invasive plant list in Wisconsin. And so I know, even as somebody whose job it is to know about these plants, it's a really overwhelming number of plants for me to keep track of. And so when we ask volunteers to report invasive plants to us, you know, people's eyes kind of glaze over and they go, well, how am I supposed to know when or where to look for all of these species? And so this calendar is kind of our attempt to help people make a custom list of invasive plant species to look for. And so again, if we have time later, I can do kind of a live demonstration of this. But basically, each row in this table is a species, and then each column is a month of the year, going from January through December. And then for each month, there's a circle. And so the color of the circle refers to the dominant life stage of that plant in that month. So if I'm looking at this first line, it's amber maple. And if I look at April, it's a green circle, which means that basically you're going to see a plant with green leaves. It doesn't have flowers yet. It doesn't have fruits. So you're going to see its leaves, and that's how you would identify it. And then how filled in the circle is how detectable it is. And so a circle that's totally empty means that that plant is basically undetectable in that month. So you shouldn't even bother looking for it. A circle that's totally filled in with color means that that is when it's easiest to see that particular species. And so if you look at this online, it's just a big giant table of circles and plant names. But above the table, there are these gray drop-down menus where you can customize your list. And so the first option is you could select the habitat that you're in or interested in. So it could be a grassland, it could be a forest. A couple more options down is you could select the detectability. So if you want to know the species that are highly detectable in grasslands, you could select those two options. And then this table will update to only show you those species. You could narrow it down even more by month. So I know lots of people who do most of their work kind of in the growing season, or maybe they make one for spring. So March, April, May, what species are highly detectable, or June, July, August, what should they look for? And so you can kind of make a short list instead of thinking about 140 some species all at once. And so just like that calendar, you can get to this from our First Detector Network page and click on that Tools tab. And again, sorry, like the map, the WISTIPP map, there is a quick guide for how you can use the features on the calendar. And then I just wanted to point out that I'm going to be talking about a few of our reporting tools. And so if you are interested in starting to monitor invasive plants and submitting reports to us of the species that you've seen, but you don't catch everything I'm talking about tonight, from our homepage on the right side of the page, if you click on I want to report invasive species, that will bring you to a page that has lots of guidance on the different ways you can report. One of which is our invasive plant monitoring handbook, which is like the really detailed guide if you really want to dig in. But there are also some short tutorial videos on there that talk about the tools that we use. And so basically, if you decide you want to get involved in invasive plant monitoring, there are several ways you can report, but we ask people to share the species name or what they think it is, when you found it, where you found it, and then actually send us some pictures too so that we can verify that it's been identified correctly or help you identify it if you're not sure what it is and you think it might be invasive. And so here's an example of teasel. I guess I do have a picture of teasel, but this is what teasel looks like in the spring. It's just this basal rosette of leaves. I'll see if I can find a flowering teasel picture later. And so for the purposes of helping out and submitting information to the Wisconsin Fish Detector Network, there's an online form on a website called EDDMapS. There's the smartphone app called GLEDN, or Great Lakes Early Detection Network, or you can email reports or questions about plant ID to this email address. So I'm going to really briefly look at EDDMapS first. This is a national website that covers only invasive species. And so it's an online database. So if you ever want to see where invasive species are across the country, this is a good place to go. But they also have nice profiles for all of the invasive species here in the Midwest and beyond, with really good pictures and descriptions of what those plants look like, or animals. It's all of the invasive species. So if you just want to see some nice pictures about a plant that you're not familiar with, this is a good place to go. But this is also where you can report observations of invasive plants, and we see these reports. And then if you end up using the smartphone app, this is also where you can manage those reports. And so this is just what the website looks like. You could click on report sightings if you wanted to let us know about an invasive plant that you found. And it brings you to this form, which has lots and lots of fields of information to fill out. But again, we only need those 4 pieces of information, which are actually highlighted in red on the form. So we need to know what's the name of the species, when did you see it, and then further down the form, there's a place to put your location. So you can enter your state and county where you saw it, and then there's this Google Maps satellite view on the right. So you can zoom in to that site, and then at the top of the map there are these tools. So you could either place a point or draw a line or a shape that shows where that infestation is. And then the last thing we ask for is pictures, and with this online form there's a way to upload pictures if you'd like. More people actually use our app though, because so many people have smartphones or tablets now, that it's much easier if you have a smartphone in your pocket and you're out for a walk and you notice an invasive plant or something that you think is invasive, you can just pull out your phone and report directly from the app. And so if you're interested in this, you can download it for either Apple or Android devices. It asks you to register for an EDDMapS account, and that basically serves 2 purposes. One is so that you can keep track of everything that you've reported by logging into your account. And the second thing is that we actually verify every report that comes in, or we review it at least. And so by registering for an account, it gives us verifiers basically your email address to be able to contact you if we have more questions about your report before we're able to positively identify it, or if it's a prohibited species, we might have some follow-up questions on it. And so it just, if you do use this system, it's going to have a lot of information on that registration form, but all we need is just your name and email address. If you're part of an organization, so you could put Wild Ones, or if you volunteer for a park that you're mapping at, you could put that, and all of the other information is optional. This is what the app looks like. So the menu is on the left. And so to actually report something, you would select the species from this species list. You can use a search box, or you can scroll down and select the species. There is a built-in field guide. And so that little red information icon, if you tap on that, you'll be able to see pictures of the plant, or the written description of it, or you could actually pull up a map of where it has been reported across the country. So using autumn olive as an example, you can see from the map that that's definitely a plant that's invasive in the eastern half of the country, not so much in the western half of the country. When you use this, you want to allow GPS tracking because the point of the app is to get a really accurate location of that infestation. And so the rest of the form looks like this. So it'll have the species name, when you saw it. When you want to take a picture, you can take a picture directly from the app. So when you click on this camera icon, the screen to the right will show up. And so the easiest thing is to say, I want to take a picture. You can then take your pictures, and you can take multiple pictures, which we encourage. So take a picture of the whole plant, take a picture, a close-up maybe of the leaves, or if there are flowers or fruits, that's really helpful for identifying it. And then with the location, because it's using either the GPS device in your phone combined with the data network, it gives you a pretty accurate location, latitude and longitude, but you can also tap on that map to open it up. And it will show, in this example, in the courtyard of these buildings, it will show a red dot where it thinks you are. But you can also, on the bottom of the screen, switch to a polygon view and actually draw a polygon. So that's really helpful for those really widespread species like garlic mustard or buckthorn or honeysuckle, where you'll never just see one of them. So if somebody, for instance, if you're at a park and the park manager is actually going to deal with that infestation, it's really helpful for them to see on a map how big that infestation is versus just a point. So if they know kind of roughly where the boundaries are, they can much more effectively plan how to manage it. And then basically back to that menu of the app, you have this upload queue. And if you click on that, that's when you can actually send the reports off of your device, at which point I get an email if it's from somewhere in Wisconsin saying that I have reports that I need to go review. And I take a look at them. And if the identification and location makes sense, I verify those reports and they show up on the maps that I showed earlier. And then land managers can access that. So going back to our Dane County Parks example, the volunteers uploaded their reports and they were then available on that WISTIPP map that I showed, and then on the EDDMapS website maps. And so the parks managers then can view that information right away and start making some management decisions based on the information that the volunteers submitted. And this is just showing on, this is the Apple version of the app. The Android version looks a little bit different, but when you upload your reports, you have to hit this actions button and then select your reports and hit upload, and then you're good to go. Of course, the third option is you could just email information to us. So again, this is a really great thing to do if you don't want to deal with an app, or if you just find something that you think might be invasive and you're not sure. Same information as before. Let us know what you think it is, when you saw it, where you saw it, and send us some photos. So we really encourage you to join our efforts with the First Detector Network. We're a very informal group. So it could be as simple as like, hey, I saw some Japanese knotweed and I just want to send you one report ever in my whole life, and that's fine, we'll take it. We want reports of prohibited species if that's what you want to focus on, or if you know of priority species locally, like maybe you know that a local park is working on a particular species, or they're worried about something like wild parsnip or Japanese barberry, you could map those reports. But really, we'll take reports of any species, even those really common ones like buckthorn and garlic mustard, because even if they don't get used directly for management, there's a lot of researchers that are using this data to do a lot of really cool work in terms of predicting where invasive plants will spread, predicting what might happen with climate change and how these plants spread. And so the more information they have to work with, the more accurate their predictions will be. Or if you're kind of looking at this and you're like, well, I don't really know what I'd do with this yet, but I know of a park that could maybe use some help with mapping their plants, or you're thinking you might want to start a new monitoring project in your area, I'm more than happy to help you get started on that, whether that's just giving some ideas on how to approach mapping invasives on a property or providing training for more people. Happy to help out with that. And I did see that there are a few things coming up in the chat box, so I'll check that really quickly. So Lisa had a question about Phragmites and whether it's being actively managed or if it's too widespread. It is definitely being actively managed. It is pretty widespread in the eastern half of the state. It is not at all widespread in the western half of the state. And so it's kind of an interesting species where in the western half of the state, it's actually still prohibited and considered an early detection species. So they will manage every infestation they can find as much as they can. In the eastern half of the state, where it's pretty widespread, it is being managed, but basically, to my knowledge, it's primarily like Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding that has funded the management of the Phragmites within that Lake Michigan basin. But that's not enough funding to cover all of the Phragmites that exists. And so I know up in Green Bay in particular, there have been some really successful Phragmites management projects where they've been able to get some good restoration in afterwards. But certainly there's way more Phragmites all up and down the Lake Michigan shoreline and further inland than we have really the resources to manage right now. So that is really all I have for as far as a formal presentation. So my contact information is here. Given COVID and the fact that I'm not in my office to answer my phone, the easiest way to contact me is to email me if you have questions or any follow-up of any sort. Pretty soon here, I'm gonna take this slide down. So if you want my contact information, be sure to write that down or grab that. And then I think we'll just move into a more informal question and answer session. So if people have questions or if you want me to show the map or the calendar, I can do that.
And thank you so much.